Before I tell you what happened out at Hell's Canyon, it's with great sadness that I must tell you it is not Peter narrating this story. It is I, Cheryl Winslow. I hold a great deal of guilt. It was my fault that Peter went out there in the first place. It's my fault that he didn't make it back. Peter was worried something like this might end up happening, so he gave me his account information in case I made it back alive. I'm sorry. This is all my fault. Upon Peter's departure from my house here in Pendleton, I contacted a couple friends of mine. Rita, an old college pal and an expert hunter who also knew Hell's Canyon like the back of her tattooed hand. As well as Kenneth, a mercenary-type militant that used to be one of my husband's co-workers. He's a cook, but I knew we would need some firepower out there. Just after the interview was published, we met up at the Dalles and loaded into my Jeep Cherokee, heading for the border of Oregon and Idaho. Hell's Canyon is absolutely gorgeous. I would highly recommend going out to visit it if you get the chance, but as you may soon discover, it might not be the vacation spot it was once considered to be. We followed a winding dirt road through the hillsides, which eventually led us into a wooded valley surrounding the Snake River that Rita suggested we take. She said that it looked promising. Boy, was she right. I hopped out of the driver's seat and swung the heavy black door shut. Y'all ready? Rita looked at me, raising an eyebrow as if to question my intelligence. Y'all? Really, Cheryl? What, are we in fucking Louisiana? She said with a grin on her face while pulling a hunting rifle and a box of .308 ammunition from the car. Peter chimed in, hey, this is serious. We're here. It's go time. We can't be dicking around, it could cost us our lives. These animals aren't anything to be taken lightly. Kenneth spoke up while loading his 12-gauge Winchester pump shotgun. What's wrong with Louisiana, Rita? My mama was born on the bayou, you know. He cocked the shotgun, expelling a red shotgun slug as he spit out the moist brown glob of Copenhagen he'd been chewing on. Rita glanced at me yet again, obviously suspicious of the gun-toting redneck I'd invited. Of course she was. She scoffed and began loading the large rounds into her own rifle. We gonna have an issue, Missy, Kenneth said, still glaring at Rita. Frustrated, Rita turned away from the car as she pulled the metal bolt of the matte black rifle back, chambering around. Nope. Her shortness enforcing the notion that they would in fact have an issue. Come on guys, let's get going. We're already behind schedule, Peter said sternly, slinging his pack over his right shoulder. Reaching out, he pulled a Colt M1911 from a hand Kenneth had extended in his direction, holstering it immediately. Where's mine, Kenny? I asked him, implying that I was eager to get my hands on a firearm as well, something that would almost never occur at any other point in my life. Kenneth reached both arms into the back of the Cherokee. He let out a muffled grunt as he retrieved something from the trunk. Well, Ms. Cheryl. This one, I brought just for you. Grinning ear to ear, he then revealed an AR-15 equipped with a holographic sight and a foregrip. Jesus Christ. What is this fucking desert storm? Rita shouted. Kenneth, now visibly irritated, snapped back. Do you see any ragheads round here, bitch? This sent my 1/4 Pakistani, although you could hardly tell, friend into a fit of rage. What did you just say, you son of a bitch? You might have some big guns, but I could kill you with my bare fucking hands, you inbred prick. Before a fist or firefight could break out, Peter stepped in between the two polar opposites, raising his arms. Knock this shit off, you two. You're gonna have to set your differences aside if we're going to make it out of this forest alive. Lowering his arms and shaking his head, Peter scoffed as he began the trek into the woods. Come on, let's move. Rita and Kenneth gave each other one final glare before we put on our packs, following after Peter. Eventually Rita took the lead, being our Hell's Canyon expert. She led our single file line of misfits through the woods. Behind her was Peter, behind Peter was me, and behind me was Kenneth. Despite the two's altercation early on, Rita and Kenneth managed to suck down their pride, most likely due to Peter's intimidating tone. After all, he was the only one who'd managed to kill one of the creatures. If anyone knew what we were up against, it was him. Rita led us down towards the edge of the Snake River and turned around to face us. "All right, the first cave is about half a mile south of here. Are you guys sure you're ready?" I could tell that Rita had begun questioning the safety of our hunting trip. "Yup. It's now or never, let's do this," I replied, faking as much confidence as I could. I nodded my head, and Rita began to guide us southbound towards the cavern. We walked in silence. No one wanted to admit it, but fear was plaguing all of our hearts. After 20 minutes of trudging through thick brush and bramble, the wooded area opened up, revealing a rock face with a small, pitch-black gap just barely large enough to crawl into. Kenneth stopped in his tracks and threw his hands up in the air. "Oh hell no. I am not going in that fucking hole." Rita, instantly recognizing this opportunity, replied sardonically, "Don't be a pussy, Kenny," simultaneously glaring and grinning at Kenneth. Kenneth plopped his semi-overweight bottom down on a nearby rock, set his shotgun on the ground, and leaned back, putting his hands behind his head. "You are what you eat." A smug grin grew on his face as we all let out an audible groan. Peter, not wanting to give Kenneth any attention, began to debrief us. "Okay, whatever. Kenny, you stay up here, I guess you can keep watch. You two, let's get our headlamps on and do this thing." Sweat dribbled down the side of Peter's head, possibly from the warm thick air, possibly from the fear of what was yet to come. Rita and I nodded in agreement as we set down our packs and reached into one of the top pockets, pulling out LED headlamps with black straps. "Yes sir," Rita replied as she strapped her lamp on. "Let's do this." Rita once again led our descent into the dark cavern, hunting rifle on her back swaying as she crawled through the small opening. After a few minutes of claustrophobic crawling, muffled grunts, and several scrapes which had accumulated on our arms, the cavern expanded. Peter pulled a red flare from his back pocket. Upon striking the flare, the damn cave was illuminated with a bright red light. "Here we are," Peter declared, pulling the handgun from his leather holster and sliding the hammer back, double-checking that the pistol was in fact loaded. Rita swung the hunting rifle from her back and into the palms of her calloused hands. "So, what do we do if we see one of these things?" Peter, straight-faced, turned around and answered Rita's question. "Shoot it. Till it drops to the fucking floor." He turned back around and began to lead us further down into the cave. Eventually, we came across a solid rock wall blocking any further movement. "Shit, dead end," I said, frustrated that we hadn't found what we were looking for, relieved that we hadn't found our demise. "Back to square one," Peter said, letting out a sigh as he began to trudge back up to the mouth of the cave. We successfully managed to crawl out of the cave and back into the bright, eastern Oregon sunshine. However, as we exited the cave, all three of us immediately noticed something. Kenneth was gone. Peter, cupping his hands around his mouth, began to shout into the woods, "Kenny! Kenny! Kenny, where are you? Fuck." Just then, something cracked on the forest floor. We all swiveled around immediately. Walking out from beneath the dark canopy was a 6-foot-tall figure. It was Kenneth. Zipping up his dirty jeans and presumably wiping piss on the blue denim, he cracked a smile and exclaimed, "You didn't think one of them beasties got me, did ya? Christ, Kenny. What the fuck?" I yelled, furious that he hadn't either peeked closer to the cave or just held it in. Rita rolled her eyes. "Oh thank goodness," she responded, once again slinging the rifle behind her back. I did the same. After the initial spelunking mission, we investigated 5 more similar limestone caverns to no avail, before setting up camp for the night. We had found a small clearing in the woods and unrolled our sleeping bags, lit a small campfire, and began to discuss our next move. Peter sat upon a log near the fire pulling a can of warm Pabst Blue Ribbon from his pack. He began brainstorming. "There's a shit ton of caves in this area. It could take weeks, maybe months before we thoroughly explore each one of them. Maybe we should just call it a trip and head out in the morning. We can always potentially come back after we do some more research." He sipped the warm beer, grimacing. "Fuck that. We have plenty of supplies. We can stay out here for at least a week before we need to head back into town." I'm not leaving until we find something. I frustratingly replied, my mind clouded with the thought of revenge, not heeding the warning Peter had given us. Makes no difference to me, I'll take any opportunity to spend a night underneath the night sky. Rita laid on top of her insulated, blue sleeping bag. Standing up she declared, hey, I have to pee, I'll be right back. We all turned towards her. Are you sure you want to go alone? I asked, remembering what had happened earlier with Kenneth. She nodded her head, her thick brown hair bobbed along with it illuminated by the orange light of the campfire. Yeah, I have a shy bladder. Pete, can I take your Colt with me? Prefer to be caught with my pants down holding a handgun, rather than scrambling for my bolt action. Yeah sure, here you go. Peter stood up from his log and leaned over towards Rita, handing her the small, silver hand cannon. Thanks, I'll be right back. Save the beer for me. Rita asked smiling, before heading into the woods. Peter raised his white can in her direction. You got it. Just like that, my friend had vanished into the darkness of the thick wooded region. She had grown up with divorced parents. Her mom taught her the ways of activism and strength through femininity, while her dad taught her the ways of the hunter and strength through nature. I trusted her to be on her own, even more so than Kenneth, our resident militant. Speaking of the gun nut, Kenneth had set his shotgun against the side of a pine tree and zipped open his large green pack, pulling out a small yellow cooler. We can stay here a couple nights, but I think we need to go back to town and rethink our strategy. If we're gonna find anything, this is easily the least efficient way to do so, Peter said, taking another sip from his beer and staring at the pine needle-riddled ground. I sighed, sucking down my pride. Yeah, maybe that's not the worst idea. I kicked at the ground, sending clumps of dirt and sap towards the campfire. Kenneth pulled a square, yellow, plastic package from his cooler. Ripping open the package, he pulled a stick of cold meat out and slid it onto a stick he'd sharpened with his pocket knife, raising it above the crackling flame as it began to sizzle. Shit, not a bad idea, Kenny, Peter said while also reaching into his pack, pulling out a small Ziploc baggie with a turkey sandwich inside. You should eat, Cheryl, you'll need the calories. Peter held out half the sandwich in my direction. Accepting the small meal, I replied softly, thanks. Are you sure we ain't just hunting a lost grizzly? Kenneth questioned, slowly looking up from the fire towards me. Infuriated, I laid into him. What the fuck, Kenny? You and Howard were close friends, and you're gonna sit there and say that a bear did that to him? Fuck off, you've been nothing but intolerable this entire fucking excursion. I don't even know why I asked you to tag along. I moved my gaze from Kenny's alarmed face to the dirty ground beneath my feet. Damn, well, sorry, is all Kenneth had to say, before a sound that can only be described as an audible version of the Holocaust rattled through the forest. Peter dropped the sandwich in shock and scanned the forest as Kenny's face grew ghostly pale. We then turned to face the thudding coming from behind us. We all swung our bodies towards the stomping, and in similar fashion as earlier in the day, Rita burst through the dark forest's edge. Panting, Rita bent over and put her hands on her knees. Holy shit. What the fuck was that? Frozen in fear, none of us had time to answer her as a hulking shadowy mass slowly formed behind my dear old friend. The same shadowy mass that killed my husband and daughter. Confused as to why we hadn't responded, Rita began, what's before she was interrupted. A large, furry, brown, clawed hand with a palm the size of a dinner plate wrapped its razor-sharp talons around Rita's skull. She barely had time to scream or fight back before the thing twisted her head off of her spine like the cap of a beer bottle. Her lifeless body fell to the ground with a loud thud. Her head, eyes rolled back, still in the clutches of the beast's left hand. The monster tightened its grip around Rita's skull. A wet crunch let out through the air as her head was reduced to pink mush lined with dark hair. Oh fuck. Let's get out, Kenneth shouted. But before he could even think to stand up, a pair of antlers which resembled a Norwegian black metal band's logo burst through his rib cage. Being raised up into the air, his flailing body vomited up a few globs of blood before the second beast, with gray fur, stood up at a towering 10 feet tall, pulled him from its antlers, and ripped him in half vertically like a piece of fleshy construction paper. Blood showered Peter and I. As the droplets collided with the campfire, a quick sizzle escaped the hot orange flame. The 6-foot-long halves of Kenneth dropped to the ground, squishing and expelling more gore from his insides. Peter dove for Kenny's Winchester, which still leaned upon one of the nearby trees. "Cheryl, start running," Peter shouted in my direction, whilst he grabbed a shotgun and aimed for the gray monstrosity that now lunged at him. Bang! Peter pulled the shotgun's trigger, nailing the creature in its left shoulder, staggering it as it let out a harsh screech. The blood coursing through my veins had been replaced with dread, but nonetheless I took this opportunity and made a mad dash in the direction of the car. It was over 2 miles away, but it was the only chance of escape we had. Peter followed. And so did the brown creature, eventually followed by the gray one once it had regained its balance. R15 pounding against my back, I sprinted through the forest, crunching twigs and leaves as I dodged thick tree trunks in the night shroud of darkness. After making it about 150 feet, I foolishly took a peek over my shoulder, just in time to see the same large brown hand reaching for my head as it did Rita's. Eyes widened with visceral terror, the palm met the top of my skull, plucking me up off the ground, as if I were an ant. I screamed, kicked, and swatted at the creature as it licked its muzzle with a long, wet purple tongue. In an instant, accompanied by a blinding flash and a deafening crack, the creature's cranium was tore from its skull, as a slug left the barrel of the Winchester, sending me onto my ass and its lifeless body to the ground. "Fucking go, Cheryl," Peter commanded towards me, as a large gray hand grabbed him by his upper leg and dangled him in the air. With a swift rip, the creature had gripped Peter's shoulder and separated his torso from his legs, spilling his entrails onto the ground with a sickening plop. Peter met his gruesome fate because I chose to go out there. The guilt I feel is immeasurable. All 3 of my friends had been murdered by these beasts. And I wasn't going to go down without a fight. I reached behind my back and yanked the high-powered assault rifle into my hands, left hand on the foregrip and right index finger on the trigger. With a mix of rage, terror, and self-preservation, I let out a shrill scream as my finger rapidly pressed down on the heavy trigger, sending dozens of 5.56 rounds flying out of the barrel and into the forest. Not one hit the creature. At least, not until the final click did a round leave the chamber and soar directly into the creature's right eyeball. The eye erupted, spewing blood and optic fluid like a volcano of gore, as the thing let out the worst noise I'd ever heard. Now holding its bloodied eye with its right hand, the thing snarled at me one more time before trotting into the darkness on all 4s, whimpering. I wish I could have stayed and mourned my dear friends, but I knew that I couldn't let their deaths be meaningless. I had to make it out of Hell's Canyon alive. By the time I made it back to the car, it was dawn, the gentle blues and oranges reflecting off the windshield of my black Jeep Cherokee. Thankfully, I had remembered to attach the car keys to a carabiner and clipped it to my belt. I removed the keys and opened the car door. As I put the keys into the ignition, the thought of my friends' corpses swam through my mind. I drove to the closest ranger station and alerted them to what had happened. Simultaneously dumbfounded and suspicious, they went out to where I had just left. Hours passed before they came back. Ultimately, they couldn't figure out what happened. There were no remains found of either my friends or the monster. Just 4 red grease marks on the forest floor. I wish I could give you a happy ending to this story. I wish I could tell you it's safe to go into the woods, but I cannot in good faith do either. I'm sorry for all of this. Please, beware the creatures that roam eastern Oregon. They've taken everything from me and they'll just as quickly take everything from you.